My research is around the experiences of women of color heads of NAIS schools, in particular, looking at how race and gender impacted their interactions with stakeholders, being board members, employees, students, and families. And so for the sake of this, I also defined woman in the most broad term, thinking about trans women, non-binary folks, female identified at birth, anyone who considered themselves a woman with an asterisk, essentially. And in terms of race, anybody who identified themselves as non-white, including mixed race or biracial folks, were also welcome to participate. So looking back at the data a little bit that I gathered on female heads specifically, so this is NAIS specific data, and I looked particularly at the past 3 years. So it looks like the past 3 years, we've seen the number of women of color drop slightly and then rise again. So although we had that minus 0.07, that delta here, our 0.3 growth the following year showed that the number of women heads is consistently rising. And you see that all in the pie chart here as well. Prior, it was 36.6% of all heads of NAIS schools were female, then 35.9, which is pretty much the same. And then it rose significantly this past year for the 2019-2020 school year, all the way up to 38.9, which brings us significantly above that 1/3 mark. Then if we look at the data for heads of color, the pie charts get a little bit smaller. So here we're looking at male and female heads of color. 2017 to 2018, we saw a 0.4% growth, and then we saw a 2% growth. So that 2% growth is healthy and it looks impressive, especially in parallel to that 0.4% growth. So in what this looks like in terms of full-on percentages, we see 7.7% of all heads are heads of color in the 2017-18 school year. We see that rise to 8.1%, and then we see that rise to 10%. But still, that is only 10% of all heads that identify as people of color. So that pie piece is still relatively small and needs to continue to grow. Which brings us to sort of the focus of what my research is, which is female heads of color. And this is where you see it really, really significant. If you remember the previous two slides, our largest delta was 3% and 2% respectively. Here we have yet to even see a delta 1% here. So looking at these numbers, female heads of color, 4.1%, 4.8%, 5.6%. So we're talking infinitesimal numbers here. And this is why I think this is so significant, because we really need to figure out what is going on in the female head of color experience that is making these numbers pretty much stay stagnant for all intensive purposes. At NAIS POCC, each year we talk about how the number of heads of color on stage is growing each year, which is phenomenal. And yet, looking at these number of female heads of color, you see this growth is just not very significant each year. I'm looking at the chat. Yes, the intersectionality of race and sex has an extreme impact, and that's part of what we're going to look at. So, thinking about inclusion versus belonging, I think a lot of times we like to think about how if a school has a woman of color head, it must mean they have reached whatever it is to reach. They are the school for DEI because they have this symbolic figurehead of a woman of color who has withstood sexism and racism and has broken the glass ceiling and has become head of school. But that's just not the picture, because there's a difference between being included and being belonged. And that's what Dr. Glasgow talked about in his address at the keynote. So just because you're included, just because you are that head of school, does not mean that you fully belong in that space. And so I think about when I'm talking to hiring committees specifically, what does it look like to develop a hiring process that was specifically intended to place a woman of color? What would it look like if you could say to a woman of color, this school was designed with you in mind? And so thinking about those pieces and how we can readjust our framework and our thinking to specifically focus on belonging rather than inclusion. Because inclusion is great, but what does it mean to be of a school, not just in a school? And so that brings us to what are the experiences of women of color heads? And here are the things that I came across. First thing that came across is that it's an unusual occurrence, unfortunately. We looked at that data, that 4%, barely 5%. We looked at that. And so to be a woman of color is not the majority by a long shot. And so a lot of women of color get what Dr. Glasgow got when he pulled up in that parking lot of, oh, you're the head of school. And that's what I coin as white shock. This reaction of surprise born of race and gendered assumptions upon discovering that a person in a position of power is a woman of color or a person of color, in the case of Dr. Glasgow. So as a woman of color, this is one of my participants speaking, I was represented by this infinitesimal tiny bar on the chart or piece of the pie. I screenshotted the chart and sent to my board chair, and he responded lightheartedly, saying, "You're a rare dinosaur." And what does it say about women of color that the first metaphor that comes to a board chair's mind, who we can assume is a white board chair, is that you are a rare dinosaur, an extinct creature that is generally associated with boys' play? What does that say about the gendered assumptions at play? What does that say about the racial assumptions at play? What does that say about the proliferation of women of color if you are referred to something that is extinct and no longer in existence? So thinking about the underlining layers of what that means, that somebody's so surprised that a woman of color or person of color could be a leader. Theme number 2 in terms of microaggressions that we came across is this feeling of, you're so amazing for a woman of color. And a quote by one of my participants, white parents are so overly effusive in their praise that I can't help but wonder that they're surprised I'm doing so well as a Black woman. This is a new head of speaking. And I can help move the conversation forward and leverage my perceived lack of difference to do it. That's a mixed race woman speaking from the position of being mixed race, white and Assyrian, thinking about how she can use her own whiteness and perceived lack of difference to move conversations forward with people who might not be as open to those conversations. But then also, what does it say that she has to leverage her perceived whiteness in order to make this happen? In order to be able to be heard, she has to lean into that white side of her, really rely on families, not realizing that she's a woman of color or she's mixed race, and seeing her as one of them as also white. And so thinking back to this first comment, that parents are effusive in their praise for new heads or new leaders or new teachers, that she can't just accept the compliment that she's doing a great job, but she has to also wonder if they mean it in terms of, you're doing well for a Black woman. We're surprised you're doing so well. And so the opportunity to feel pride and accept a compliment at face value, I think, can also be very indicative of one's own privilege. To be able to just bask in the glory of a compliment without having to wonder, is this rising from some more sinister message? And thirdly, turning the tables and being a mirror in a school of windows. One woman says, I'm always going to be a woman of color, so race is never going to be off the table. That's something she said to the board when they were looking to hire her in her position. So being upfront with hiring committees, with board committees, saying, I am a woman of color. If you bring me into this school as a woman of color, here's what you're going to get. I'm going to talk about race. I'm going to talk about gender because that's who I am. That's never off the table with me. So if you're hiring me, that's who you're hiring. And then for women of color, working with students, I asked them specifically, what is it like to work with students, especially students of color? And one woman responded, let's be honest, I see a mirror in my students of color too. And that's a powerful moment when a person in a position of power can say about their elementary school students, I see myself in them. Not just, I hope they can see themselves in me and envision themselves as future leaders, but also getting down on their level and saying, I see you in me and I see me in you. And then for parents, one head quoted a parent saying, I'm so glad my daughter gets to look at you every day. And so what is that symbolism? When we put a teacher in a classroom, when we put a head in her office, when we put an administrator in her office, what does that mean for families when they're coming through the admissions process to be able to walk by the head of school's office and see a woman or a woman of color or a person of color looking and smiling and greeting them? What does that say to families about who you are as an institution? And so a lot of families, a lot of heads did say that families of color came to their school specifically for the head of school because of who that person was in that position of leadership. And they wanted that mirror for their son or daughter or child. And so thinking about this concept of windows and mirrors, how that comes into play in our hiring and how that also can be an asset to somebody's resume to a school, not just their credentials and where they went and the conferences they presented at, but also their identity. How can their identity be an equal contributor to their resume and what they bring to the table? So those are some things that I thought about, along with one of the main themes, which was the pride and joy and determination that folks felt, being unapologetically themselves. And these were words of wisdom that our heads had to future heads, to aspiring heads, to teachers, administrators alike. Be your truth, know your truth. And then that it was a true joy, despite the challenges, despite the microaggressions, that it's just been an overall wonderful experience to be ahead of school. And then finally, that it took determination and a lot of it to defy stereotypes, especially for women, thinking about women who are not necessarily loud or extroverted or showy, but really redefining what it means to be a leader. That leaders can also be quiet, leaders can be gentle, but leaders can also be powerful, and that power is also ingrained in that quietness, in that gentleness, in that femininity. So, depending on what energy that you bring, really rethinking about how leadership looks and what on those job descriptions really speaks to what you want your leader to be like, and how those might be also rooted in gendered or racial terminology that might be coded language. Thinking about how to really refigure that and also redefine those terms. So those are just some of the things that I thought about that I thought would be helpful to you, especially as you're thinking about hiring, as you're thinking about um, the ways in which you can better support your folks who you're placing or who you're working with or who you're consulting with. And I just want to pause there because we had a couple other people hop into the Zoom meeting, and I wanted to give them a chance to introduce themselves if they would like. Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like.
Hi, Laura. I'm Shoshana Sumka. I'm the Executive Director of ICENE, and I just wanted to hear your presentation. Thanks.
Sure.
Hi, Laura. I'm Mary Henningsen. I'm an education consultant, and like Shoshana, same. I'm just interested to hear your perspective and your presentation. Thanks.
Sure, happy to do so. I also noticed, Robert, that Mary's video is pinned. Can you all see me?
I can see you fine.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, no worries. I won't worry about the pin then. It looks like we have a lot of consultants in the room and folks who are working not necessarily directly in a school of your own, but also with a variety of schools. So I'm actually going to pivot slightly to thinking about various things that you can do. One of the things that I always talk to schools about is professional development and thinking about how their professional development needs to encapsulate their values. And so at Blake School, where I work right now, we currently just launched our Intercultural Competence Professional Development Day. And that's a day entirely devoted to intercultural competency and to professional growth. And it's for our entire school faculty, staff, admin, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, everybody in the middle. And so this is a massive day in which we want everybody to participate. And I want to talk a little bit about advising schools on structuring their own professional development. So this process actually started off with goals back in September. So back in September, we had everybody set cultural competence goals for themselves, whether it be in their classroom or in the works that they did, thinking about how they can tailor that specific to HR or to the business office or to their work in a non-classroom setting. And so that was one of the pivotal things that we did, thinking about how can they tailor what they need and thinking about cultural competency and diversity, equity, inclusion as an ongoing goal in their work. And so from there, they worked on their own personal mission statement. And so I think that's something that I want to do with you all today. And I'm just pulling up this presentation really fast as we pivot. So I apologize for the delay. Since you all are working so much with various people who might not necessarily be classroom teachers yourselves or aspiring heads yourselves, I want to think about your work as consultants or as an educators in the capacity that you do. So I want you to take a moment and think about your values. What are your values? Feel free to write some down, put some in the chat, what things are so pivotal or so core to who you are as a person that they come through in every work that you do with a school that you're working with, or a school that you're currently part of, or just even in your personal life? What are those core values for you? I see some coming through directly to the chat to me. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to share those out or not, so I'll keep them to myself since they're private messages. Community, equity, integrity, professionalism, being a learner and a giver, empathy, kindness, relationship building, equity, justice, love, honesty, relationships, empathy, equity. Okay, so empathy and equity have come up a lot. And these are values that I think a lot of us hold really dear to who we are as a person. But values are abstract ideas. And as we all know, especially for those of you who are doing strategic planning processes with schools, how do we make those values tangible and actionable? So I want you to take a moment and think about how you could connect your core values to a mission statement for your work. So that as you're going out to schools, consulting with them or working with them, you can say, this is who I am. Here's how I take my abstract values and put them into actionable mission statements. So as an example, I'll share my own, and then we will create ours. My values I identified are humanness, respect, justice, and balance. And then from those, I create the mission statement. I will use my voice and my power to work in solidarity for the interconnected liberation of all. I will model seeing the dignity and humanity in every person by leading with empathy, understanding, and mutual respect. So do you see the connection between my abstract values and the concrete mission statements? This is what we do all the time with schools when we're advising them on how to connect their school values to their school mission statement. But we often don't think about it in terms of ourselves. So now it's your turn. I would like you to just take 5 minutes to create a mission statement for you and your work, something that you might be able to share out with people who might want to hire you for consulting, or who you might want to, something you might want to hang on your office to remind you of why you do the work you do. But think about your core values and how they can inform a mission statement that's memorable, inspiring, actionable, powerful, and clear. So take a moment, either do it on pen and paper or open up a note or Word document really fast and just sketch out some ideas. And I'm modeling for you a process that we went through with our entire faculty. We did this for every single teacher to prepare them for thinking about what their goal is for the year in terms of intercultural competence. Thank you to those of you who just finished that mission stating writing activity. I want to share with you now why I had you do that, because that's part of a larger thing that we've been doing with our faculty, which leads into that professional development day that I was saying. So at the beginning of the year, we have them set goals for themselves. And so this is a sample for you. We have them create a goal very specific to what they're doing and intercultural competency. And they first actually do that mission statement activity. So we ask them, what do you value? So that means their goal will specifically connect to what it is that they said they valued and that they care about in their classroom, and how they want to make that actionable. So this is one sample goal that we pulled, to create a gender inclusive space in their classroom, to have pictures and quotes from people across the gender spectrum, to highlight trans and non-binary voices, and to invite students to share their pronouns. So that's one goal. And I had them made it very specific. And how exactly will you do this? What exactly do you want to accomplish within that broader goal? And then the measurability. This is sort of like a modified SMART goal. The measurability piece, the metric we used are see, feel, and hear. So how will I or somebody in your classroom see, feel, and hear that you're implementing your goal of gender inclusivity in your classroom? We will see the shelves stocked with stories about people from across the spectrum. You'll model respectful language. You will hear people using, what pronouns do you use, as opposed to just assuming. People will feel like they can share their pronouns and feel like they want to engage in that kind of conversation. And then that mission-driven piece that I was talking about, how does this connect not to the mission of the school, but to the personal mission statement that we just did as a group and they all did, the faculty did at a prior meeting. And then finally, how does it align with the Danielson framework? I often hear people talk about how do you make DEI work evaluatable? Is there a rubric for DEI work? And so yes, actually there is. Has anybody heard of the Danielson framework for evaluation? Okay, so if you have not, then the Danielson framework is sort of a four-part framework for thinking about classroom evaluation. So it is planning and preparation is domain 1. Domain 2 is the classroom environment. Domain 3 is instruction. And domain 4 is professional responsibilities. And in this document, we actually took this Danielson framework, which is mainly pedagogical and for teaching curriculum, and we actually made it about cultural competency and aligned it. So planning and preparation, how do I consider my students' backgrounds as I design lessons, assessments, and compile a diverse and comprehensive list of materials and resources? And then we have some examples of that. Domain 2, classroom environment. How do I create an inclusive classroom environment that scaffolds learning and appropriately engages and challenges students using effective intercultural communication, affirms students' home cultures, etc. Domain 3, how can I be culturally responsive and provide opportunities for students to connect and learn from each other? So co-creating knowledge in the classroom, that we're all teachers and learners simultaneously, no matter our age or our credentials. And domain 4, professional responsibilities. How can I continue learning about myself and approach all of my professional responsibilities through an equity lens, an inclusion lens? And so part of that is also your own self-reflection to understand your own multiple identities and your attitudes and biases in order to create an optimal classroom environment. So especially for those of you who are consultants in the room, I want to think about how you can use this for schools who are wondering, how can we evaluate cultural competency? How can we do cultural competency, professional development, and measure growth over time? This is a really useful framework that you can use and offer to schools as a resource as they think about concretely identifying the areas of growth for their school and which ones they want their teachers to hone in on for the year. And so I want to share with you all one other tool, but I also want to welcome Emily to the space. I saw you joined us just a moment ago. Hi, Emily.
Hello, sorry I was late. I was teaching.
No worries, understandable. Many of us have been or are. So I want to think about one more or maybe two more resources with you all that you can use to share with your students. And this is where we'll practice that sort of self-reflection piece, that domain 4 you saw a little bit. I see in the chat, I'd love to read through this. Can you share a copy? Yes, I can share a copy. Was that, Hubert, in reference to the Danielson framework?
Yeah, that document, I really kind of want to read through the bullets. It looks great.
Sure, happy to do it. Just put it in the chat. The final, one of the final things I want to share with you right now is a resource called Cards on Race. Has anybody worked with Cards on Race before? No. So this is actually something that was developed by Dr. Howard Stevenson, and it came out of Amherst University. I'm going to share my screen one more time. This is a useful tool I find for both adults and students alike, especially older students. This is something we also did with our faculty, thinking about professional development for your faculty. And so I'm going to model for you, and we're going to participate together in an exercise right now that I did with our faculty to reflect on their own feelings. So as a participant, putting your participant hat on and taking off your teacher or consultant hat, the Cards on Race framework works like this. There are a bunch of cards that have different themes to each deck of cards. It all comes in a box and they're different decks. So one deck is called the topic deck. So a topic related to race arises. You can see some examples here. Maybe it's neighborhoods, privilege, policing, colorblindness, hair, activist movements. And that sparks in you an emotional response. Maybe it's a response of anxiety if you're talking about policing, or numbness if you're talking about privilege, or healing, or belonging if you're talking about neighborhoods, or unaware. And then from there, there's a racial coping strategy. So you have the topic arises, you have the emotional response. Now, what do you do with those feelings? You can either assimilate, maybe physical activity, maybe some self-care, maybe some healthy racial comeback lines. I know sometimes people approach me and they talk to me, they approach me and they assume I speak Chinese, and so they're saying something to me in Chinese. And then I actually don't speak Chinese because I was adopted, and so I actually respond to them in Spanish. And so that's my part of my healthy racial comeback line, is to help them check their own assumptions, because I speak Spanish and I use it to teach in Costa Rica. Or maybe activism, or maybe you just ignore it. Maybe that's part of your racial coping strategy. So obviously some of these ones are healthier than others, but they're all parts of racial coping strategies. And there have been a lot of topics related to race that have come up throughout this year. So let's just think about this past calendar year. We started or at least last school year, I mean. We started the school year with Black at Black ads. For my school, it's Black at Blake. Maybe your school or schools that you worked with had Black ad accounts. We started the year with COVID. We started the year with George Floyd and the summer of racial reckoning. We started this year on Zoom or Google Meet for many of you. It was quite a year. There were a lot of racially packed topics in there. We started the year thinking about recommitting to social justice in the wake of George Floyd after all the Black ad accounts, but also dealing with this huge issue of being online and remote learning and those competing interests of, do we have time for DEI work amongst the work we're doing, trying to get all of our remote learners into classrooms and with the materials they have. And all that seemed to come by in one big blur. And then suddenly we're in January, and we had January 6th happen, the insurrection at the Capitol. We had the election happen in November. Then we had the inauguration happen just this week. And we have all these moments where things came up, racial topics came up. So I want you to, and all of those probably sparked a lot of feelings in us. So I want you to actually go to the website, cardsonrace.com. I'll put it in the chat right now, and click on virtual deck. So here's the website. I'm just going to put the link in the chat right now and we'll do it together. But please do this on your own computers, because this will be an independent activity with you as well. Thinking about your own the racial climate of where you are. So not all of you are in school. So if you're in a school, think about your school. If you're not in a school, think about your sphere. That could be who you live with. That could be your neighborhood. That could be people you work with and engage with, your sphere. So go to cardsonrace.com. The link is in the chat. And up here, you will click virtual deck in the top right. I'm going to ask one favor of you all, since for what we're going to do in about 15 minutes, for our last 15 minutes, we're actually going to close in affinity spaces, just to have some time to process things that you're hearing this week at this conference, or things that have happened in the world this week, because I think we all just need some time to process everything that's gone down. So if you would rename yourself with your first, prior to your first name, please put either white or POC. The word white or the letters POC. And that way our amazing operator, Robert, can start creating 2 breakout rooms, one white, one POC, so that for the last 15 minutes and a few minutes, we can close in affinity spaces, just talking a little bit about debriefing what's going on. Alrighty, thank you. And Robert, hopefully that will help you as well. Feel free to private message people if you need to know what group they're in, if they're having trouble changing their name. Alrighty, so I just want to show you one more tool that I often use when I'm doing professional development with folks, either with students or with faculty or staff or administrators or boards. One thing I like to think about is culture. And oftentimes we think about culture as the F's, the foods, the festivals, and the families. Often is what we think about as culture, and languages and things like that. But I want to think beyond that, about what makes culture. And a lot of schools, primarily white independent schools, are steeped in what's called white dominant culture. Has any of you heard the term white dominant culture, white supremacy culture before? Okay, so when I talk about white supremacy culture, I'm not talking about the insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol. I'm not talking about the KKK. I'm not talking about the people with tiki torches. I'm talking about the dominant narratives that we have and values that we have in organizations and in institutions and in our own lives. And so that's one very clear distinction I want to make before I move into this part. So some amazing people, Kenneth Jones and Thema Okun, coined the term white supremacy culture a few years back. And they identified these aspects as part of white supremacy culture: fear of open conflict, quantity over quality, perfectionism, either or thinking, paternalism, worship of the written word, only right way, right to comfort, defensiveness. These are all parts, power hoarding, these are all parts of white supremacy culture. So as you're looking at this list, perhaps you see some things in the way that this shows up in your workplaces or in your schools or even in your own thinking. I know I do for sure. When I think of fear of open conflict, I think of times in our nation's history where something really big has happened and this sort of obscure email communication goes out from the head of school that kind of addresses it, but kind of doesn't because they don't want to be political. I think of right to comfort as the parent who calls in and says, my kid was made really uncomfortable when you called him out in class today, and I think you should apologize to my child for what you did. I think of worship of the written word as there's an incident on the playground, and the first thing you need to do is write down exactly what happened in accurate detail and minute detail in case there's a lawsuit, because it has to be in writing. I think of individualism as this understanding of every kid is so unique, they need their own unique curriculum, and they cannot learn what every other kid's learning because they need something that's just made perfectly for them for their learning. I think of objectivity as grading. All the grades have to be objective. There has to be a rubric and it has to only be objective, when we know in actuality there's no such thing as objectivity, really. This sense of urgency, I was trying to push out an email yesterday and I said it would go out at 3:30 and it was 3:31 and I was stressing out because I hadn't sent out the email with the announcement to launch the professional development day I said would launch at 3:30. It was 3:50 and nobody noticed it wasn't out yet. That urgency that I was feeling, that we feel as professionals a lot of the time, that in order to keep our job, we need to get this out now. That's all part of white supremacy culture. It's a part of many cultures. I want to also acknowledge that there are parts of that are part of various cultures, but just because it's part of one culture does not mean it can't be part of another culture. So that doesn't make it exclusive to white supremacy culture. I just want to clarify that. And also clarify that people of color can absolutely be steeped in white supremacy culture. And I'm not just talking about the few BIPOC people you saw at the Capitol the other day. I'm talking about people who work in a culture and in a school that really supports these values, including myself. And I'll give you an example of that more a little bit later. But let's talk a little bit about perfectionism. How does this show up in schools, in institutions, in workplaces? Little appreciation is expressed for people for the work that they're doing, and appreciation is usually directed at the people who get the most credit or attention anyway. It's more common to point out how the work is inadequate, and it's even more common to talk about the inadequacies behind somebody's back and not to their face. People are seen as mistakes. They're seen as personal. Making a mistake was confused with being a mistake, and little time or energy is put into reflecting on what went right and how to improve. And there's a tendency to identify what's wrong without appreciating the right. Second one I want to look at more closely. We're only going to look at 3 closely. All resources of an organization are directed towards producing measurable results. Things that can be measured are highly valued. So how many people come to a meeting? How much money is in this budget? How many people are going to attend this event? How many things are going to be circulated? Relationships are not valued as highly as what can be counted. There's little comfort with feelings or emotion. There's little or no value attached to process. And there's the understanding there's a conflict between content and process. So sometimes it's this feeling of, I've got to get through this agenda. I know people have feelings, but we can't deal with that right now. I got to get through this agenda. And then finally, fear of open conflict. People in power are scared of conflict and try to ignore it. When someone raises an issue that causes discomfort, the person is blamed rather than looking at what's actually going on. There's an emphasis on being polite. This is really important in independent school culture as well. And there's an equating with raising difficult issues with being impolite or rude or out of line. So these are 3 parts of white supremacy culture. And I want to take just a minute, and I've created a Jamboard. I want us to think about how each of these shows up in your workplace or in your school or in your life beyond that. And I'm going to share this link with you. If you receive here, there's a 1 out of 3. If you hit that little arrow, it will go to 2 out of 3. There are 3 slides, and I'd like you to just add on sticky notes how you see each of these 3 showing up in the work that you do. So I'm going to pop this link into the chat really fast for the Jamboard. And we'll just take a couple minutes, and I'll read some out as they pop up. All right, so once you click on this link, if you've not used Jamboard, over to the left-hand side, the 4th one down is a little square that should be sticky notes. And you can click on a sticky note. Oh, do you not have access to it? My apologies, I forgot. Let me, I see you trying to grab access. Let me just change the link really quick so that everybody has access. My apologies. Alrighty, try that again. I can also update the link. Everybody should have access now. My apologies for that. Alrighty. So go ahead and start adding in some sticky notes. How do you see this showing up in where you work, or in the work that you do, or in schools that you've worked with? Remember, you can swipe to pages 2 and 3 to answer those other fear of open conflict and quantity over quality.
Laura, sorry to interrupt. We have viewing access now. We need editing access.
That's not helpful. My apologies.
I do this every day in my classroom. I make the same mistake, so I have a lot of empathy right now.
There you go. Now you're an editor.
Do you want us to just write a word or like a specific example? Like a
An
basic-
example would be great if you have
like
a,
an
could
anecdote.
do it in a few words.
Okay.
Oh my goodness, we've had some folks join us. Hi to those of you joining us. We are actually in a Jamboard right now. I'll put the link in the chat one more time. We have 3 things on the table right now. Aspects of white supremacy culture: perfectionism, quantity over quality, and fear of open conflict. And we're creating sticky notes about how we see each of these show up in our workplace or in our school or in our personal lives. Right to an A regardless of effort or competency, I see on the Jamboard. Yes, absolutely. Someone with dyslexia being teased because there's a misspelling in a note. Yep. Absolutely, holding each other to really high standards. So concerned about the image of the school that we permit behaviors that are harmful for kids or the future of humanity. Yeah, that's huge. How many classes can a student take as opposed to the mastery of the material presented? Too concerned about being politically correct. Yeah. I see this a lot in students with the quantity over quality, as well as the perfectionism, like needing to get an A, like really having anxiety about their grades, which is then perpetuated by systems that reward A's, that reward 4.0s. Confident familiarization versus understanding, learning for a grade versus joy and desire to learn. Quote, you have diverse ideas, but we see them as problems. Can't you be more of a team player, end quote. That assumption that diverse thought and ideas are problematic, not welcoming and healthy. White folks not standing up publicly when whiteness is prioritized. Yep, for sure. Also thinking about competition for budgets between departments. I know we're still thinking about ideas, but I also want to make sure we have time for affinity groups. So I'm just going to think really fast about what do we do about this all? And luckily in Jones and Okun's article, they offer some solutions, hopefully, or antidotes as they call them. So perfectionism, they think about developing a culture of appreciation where people's works and efforts are appreciated, that really values that progress. So I was thinking about it this other day when I was doing some professional development for faculty, thinking about how can we physically reward mistakes in a way that is meaningful for students as well as our employees. What if we had a system where they actually get a grade for mistakes or for progress? Because that's really motivates students. What about in our evaluation systems for our employees that we really reward growth and learning? How can we really institutionalize that? Thinking about quantity over quality. Include process or quality goals in your planning. Make sure your organization has a value statement that shows how you want people to do work and that this is a living document. Measurable progress goals. Learn about those times where you need to get off the agenda in order to address underlying concerns. And then also fear of open conflict. Understand that discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning. Welcome it as you deepen your analysis of oppression and racism and how your personal experiences fit into it. And then finally, don't take everything personally. And this last point I found funny. This is the one where I copied this language from Jones and Okun as they suggested it, but I almost rephrased that one because that one sounded a little too impolite to me, like something I wouldn't say. But then that reminded me how rooted I am in white supremacy culture. If I feel like I need to take this language written by a Black person and make it more polite in order to present to my faculty in my independent school, what does that say about how we need to phrase things, especially as people of color, in order to be taken seriously? So that's just my own anecdote and why I didn't change the language. So I said we would end in affinity groups, and I want to continue to do that. I know I had a couple people, one person join us. If you just joined us, feel free to direct message the operator of which affinity group you'd like to be put into. Because at this point, I want to offer us the opportunity for the last 15 minutes to think about what we talked about earlier in terms of microaggressions, in terms of topics and feelings, and in terms of those key words we talked about, pride, joy, and determination that really were standout words for heads of school. So in breakout rooms that we're about to send you off into, if you're in the BIPOC affinity group, what do the words pride, joy, determination mean to you? And what does it mean to show up as your full self every day? And in the white affinity group, how can individuals and institutions create a culture that honors the pride, joy, and determination of BIPOC folks? And how can you personally take the concept of inclusion versus belonging? Remember, we talked about what it means to be included versus what it means to belong, to truly have an institution or a workplace or a search process that was built for a person of color, not just for a person who happens to be a person of color. How can you take that concept into your work? And then also use this time to talk about anything else you need to talk about. Feelings, things that have happened this week. It's been a really big week in our country and in our schools. So take this time, use it as you need it to have those conversations and process. All right, so if you have the links you need, thank you all so very, very much. I appreciate having you here. This was a great discussion. We had a great time in the BIPOC affinity group. Hope you all also had a fruitful time in the white affinity group processing this crazy world we're in. And I hope you got some tools today that could help you either with school you're consulting with, students you're working with, or in your own life.